Playing with Stories, a system designer's approach to narrative in video games. My name is Ali Reda. I'm the system designer in question, and I was asked to let you know to switch off your phones or put them on silent for this talk. Thank you. So I'm very stoked to be able to give this talk to you because this is a topic that I'm very passionate about. This is essentially the reason why I decided to work in the industry in the first place. I am a game designer, I am a system designer, but that wasn't always the case. I wanted to learn how to tell stories through video games because it was this huge potential that I saw in video games that got me motivated to get into this industry in the first place. It were the games that had big, full, luscious stories that I could immerse myself for weeks and weeks, that sparked this little joy in me that when I found out that you could study this, that you could have a job just making stories, I was elated and I was like, this is it, this is what I want to do. But then, when I got into the industry and I got the chance to work on multiple games that had story involved in them, I realized a couple of things. And I saw how games and game design and story, how they are sometimes working together well and sometimes not. Sometimes you have game design and story close to each other and both support each other, benefit each other, and create this one immersive experience that creates something that is bigger than the sum of its parts. And other times they are very far apart. And then you have something where one thing is becoming an obstacle to the other. You just want to play the game, but the story keeps interrupting you, or you have to grind through the game to get to the interesting story that you actually care about. And in the end, you just wish that one of these two parts would just like get out of the equation so you could focus on the thing that you relate to. And so with this talk, I want to give you a little bit of my perspective as a system designer on narrative, how you can integrate story better with your game design, how you can strive to create experiences that are much more in tune with each other and with the flow of the game, and that never interrupt each other, but are something that will bring you an experience that you wish the player has. So, who am I and why am I here on stage? There's a little bit of background about me. I've worked in this industry for 7 years now, and I was very lucky to have worked on approximately over 10 commercially released games. They are out on PC and console, and many also on mobile. I'm currently working as a feature designer at Vuga. And quick disclaimer here, I'm not representing Vuga with this talk, and everything I'm saying here is just my own thoughts and opinions. So because Vuga is making this game here, June's Journey, it's also a narrative-focused casual mobile game, but what I'm focusing on is more in the PC and console realm, because narrative on mobile is a whole different beast that warrants its own talk. But yeah, as I mentioned, I never envisioned myself becoming a feature designer or focusing on system design. When I started, I wanted to do stories. And so when I discovered the job title narrative design, I was like, hell yeah, let's go. This is what I want to do. And so I was very lucky to find a place that focused on narrative-heavy games. I got to work, for example, on this game up here, Love Stories, that's made with a German book publisher, where they had like a book in their own series, and they wanted a digital version with it, where you could influence the plot, right? And so you have dialogue options, and you choose what is happening with the story, and then you see the consequences of your choices. And I also worked on more sort of like traditional games in the sense of that you have this core of main mechanics that are maybe RPG based or action adventure based, and story is happening around it, where it's told through quests and missions and so on. And so my work as a narrative designer looked kind of like that. I had these huge, absolutely intricate structures that I wasn't even only writing the stories, I was also implementing them. I was thinking about how to implement them, when information is revealed to the player, at what point, what needs to be considered when I tell a story, at what moment in the game is the player maybe too busy with other things to receive story, and when would I do story well as like a break or something like that. I had dialogue written like that, where you think you have only 3 sentences on the screen, but it's triple the size because everything is a choice. And so it just grows exponentially. And you have to keep in mind what did the player choose at what point, how can I reference that back, right? And so it's this huge elaborate system that I was fully immersed in, and I was happy for the first couple of years that I did that. But then the longer I was working in the industry, the longer I worked on these type of games, I started to feel more and more like the person in The Writer Will Do Something, which is a lovely little game by Tom Bissell and Matthew Burns. It's like a little twine game where they are parodying a business meeting of a AAA studio, where a game is about to be finished, but there are bugs. Playtesting sessions have revealed a couple of problems, and so the leads of each department get together and they want to see what can they do to fix this. They don't have much time, they don't have much resources. What are they doing? Well, the writer will do something. And so it's from the perspective of the writer, and each department lead that has nothing to do with story is saying, hey, we just slap a little bit of story on top of it. Oh, this is not working out. Oh, we just explain it with story, right? We'll fix all the rough edges and corners with a little bit of story. And so that is something that I have noticed for myself, that story was sometimes this icing on the cake, sort of to say, that is supposed to create this beautiful layer, this wrapper around the game and bring everything together. Or sometimes it was like glue between levels and to explain why something was happening and make sense in the world that the player is inhabiting in, right? So story was never part of the core experience, but it still was supposed to be there and fix all the little problems. And then also there was like this little insult in there that because it's just words, because it's just typing, everyone can operate a keyboard. Basically everyone can do it. And so it's easy, it's cheap, right? It's an easy to obtain asset, which is not the case, right? And so if you think like that, if that is how story is treated in your game, that is what then can happen when story gets in the way of gameplay. Because in those moments, story is not seen as something tangible in the design. It is not seen as something that takes up space or takes up time. It's just this magic thing that is in the game and makes everything work. But it does take up space, and it takes up a lot of space. And it takes up, most importantly, sometimes player control. And that's when it gets tricky. That's when you have the moments where the story gets in the way of your gameplay experience. And so I want to share with you my perspective on the gameplay experience. And I want to show you, with an example, what kind of influence choice of storytelling element has on the game flow. How you can visualize that. And then afterwards, I will show you what you can then do with that information that you have acquired. And so I have chosen a clip to show you, which is not going, but it's fine. And I've chosen a clip from Alan Wake. It came out in 2010 and was developed by Remedy Entertainment. Couple of disclaimers here. I will switch the video. Don't worry about that little text over there. So I have picked this clip from the very beginning of the game, right? So there shouldn't be too many spoilers, but also this game is now 13 years old. There are kids on TikTok that are younger. At this point, I don't know what to tell you. It's not a very super exciting clip, so nothing of big importance happens there. There's also not much gore, and even though it has horror elements, it shouldn't be too scary. So if you do not like horror games or blood or something, there isn't much of it. There's a little bit on the main character on the side, but nothing there. And it also might be a bit goofy, because I have decided to speed up this clip in double speed. Because I didn't want us to watch for hours how Alan Wake runs through a forest. And so I'll show you this clip. There's no sound, don't worry. I will narrate you through it. And afterwards, I will analyze it. So. Whoops. Wait a second. Yes. Haha. All right, so we start off with Mr. Wake running down this hill. And we get our first quest that we want to reach this gas station here. We receive the quest, we get up in the UI section over there that this is where we're going. We got a focus point that we can do. We watch the car run down, so we got out there in time. And we continue running through the forest. We do that because there was no obvious, clear way to the gas station, so we have to follow this hiking path through the forest. We encounter the slide, and we are being introduced to the collection mechanic of the game, right? So we see this paper flying around, and it's a manuscript page, because Alan Wake is an author, and he discovers that an idea for a book that he had is kind of randomly strewn around through the forest, and it tells him either what is happening now or what is happening in the future, right? And so this is something that you can collect in the game. So we continue to follow the path. We start to see a hint of maybe an entity in the background, but we don't engage yet. It's disappearing again. And then the moment we come around this corner, we are getting our new sub-quest, so to speak. We get the option to focus on this hut. And this is where we hope we can find help, as the UI indicates to us. So we break and enter private property in hopes to find help here, or maybe a living soul. And we do. We find a nice gentleman that we tell we were in a car crash, and maybe they can help us. And this nice fella is having none of it. So he's there with an axe, and that is our introduction to our first enemy kind of the game. He is not reacting to us and runs away, and we notice, okay, this is probably not the best situation to be in. So we want to go to the hut. We encounter a collectible, the manuscript page, and we read it because we figured out that maybe it can tell us something about this man that we just met, help us maybe in a potential fight, because it is an element used to foreshadow things. We continue. We're getting a little spooked up in here. Then we have the enemy jumping above our heads. They're very limbo. We are not. We see the hut in front of us, and this man decides to finally chase us properly. And so we run into the light, and we hope and get in time, close the door, have a Jack Nicholson and Shining moment. But we made it. We're safe here. We look around. We see the weapons, and that's how the game introduces us to the fighting. So here the video ends, but as you can see, we have now throwables and weapons, so after this we would also be able to fight that gentleman. So let me quickly switch over to my presentation. This thing is not working anymore. Oh, it does. Well, that's how it goes with technology. You always pretend it doesn't work, and then it gets jealous and works for you. So what I first want to do is to just put down the game loop, right? What is it that the player is actively doing in this clip that I showed you? It also represents a little bit what the player can do in the entirety of the game, right? So we start off, well, damn, I lied. Anyway. So we start off by receiving a quest, right? That was the gas station for us. We saw the lie. We saw, okay, this is where we need to go. The UI indicated that to us. We then continue to explore. And I call it explore because I was just running very straightforward through the forest there. But what you can actually do is look a bit in the bushes and around the forest in hopes of finding the next section, which is collectible items. So we were introduced already to the manuscript pages, of course, but there's also other stuff like coffee flasks and, of course, ammunition, things like that, right? So collecting is an important factor. Then we can fight enemies. We didn't do the fighting here per se. We are having a chase scene, but this is something in the realm that is happening often, and so that's how I generalized it. And then we reach a goal. It could be the initial quest goal, it could be a sub-goal, but that's basically how it goes, right? We reach the goal, then we receive the next quest, we explore, collect items, fight a little bit, and then we reach the next section, and that's it, right? So those are kind of the actions that the player can do in this game. However, I shouldn't stand in front of the screen, apologies. However, this does not represent what we just saw in the clip, right? This is not the gameplay experience. This is just something that you would, for example, put on a pitch document, when if you were to say, hey, these are all the amazing actions that the player can do. So on this next slide, I have included these steps, but also put in everything that is outside of the game loop, but we still saw happening in the clip. Right, so we start off with exploring, actually, right? So we get out of the car and we run down this little hill. And then we focus on the destination, which is the gas station for us, right? Even though I said receive quests, for us it was done by focusing on this point. Then we continue to explore through the forest. We get another focus on a point of interest. It was an optional focus, right? So there was this input that was requested from us to press the joystick button, and then the camera shifted and looked at the car that we just left. But it's happening. Then we continue to explore the forest. We get a cutscene where we are getting introduced to the manuscript pages. And then we continue to explore, right? We run through the forest, we see this murky figure, but nothing really happens there until we get the next focus on a point of interest, which was the hut, which also changed a little bit our quest there. Continue to explore. Another cutscene where we get introduced to the first enemy of the game. We collect an item, and in the clip, we chose to read the manuscript that we have just collected, because we have learned beforehand that maybe it will help us in whatever comes before us. Then we have the fight chase scene, and we are reaching the goal with the hut, which then leads to the next cutscene. And then incidentally, what we do next is also, again, explore. So we are in this house. I didn't show it to you, but you can then go through the house. You can try to find things. You need to find a way out, which also leads again to another focus point on of interest. But that seems to be sort of the rhythm of the game that it follows. That seems to be the flow that it wants, right? And so, as you can see, I have divided this loop into two sections. I have blue-colored sections and I have yellow-colored sections. And so all the blue-colored sections are the sections from the game loop before. Those are the player actions. Those are the moments when the game requires for the player to give input. Without player input, the game is not progressing, right? And that's crucial. The yellow moments are moments when player input is not required, right? It will happen regardless whether the player did it or not, right? We have these optional focus on point of interest moments where a player input is required in the sense of we are opting in to have the camera move, and I will talk about that in the later slide. But mostly, or in general terms, the yellow moments are the moments when player input is not provided. And incidentally, those are also the moments when story is told in this game, right? We have a cutscene, and in the cutscene is the dialogue. We have the manuscript pages where we have a text that is written by apparently Alan Wake. And so here we have sort of like the first visualization of what your choice of storytelling element does to the game flow, how much space it takes up, and when it happens. But this is not sort of like the most crucial thing. What is more important for me is the fact that there is a shift when it comes to player input, right? We have player input is required, player input is not required. And so I've created this very scientific graph where on the x-axis you see all the points that we just listed in the second-to-second loop. And then on the y-axis you see something that I just titled player control. So 1 is full player control. If the player does not put anything into the controller, right? If they are not pressing any buttons or something, nothing will continue with the game. And 0 is when the game would continue without you. It's basically like if you switch on a movie and fall asleep, the movie will continue without you. The movie does not care if you watch it or not, right? And so this is basically 0 control. And what we see is that we have this up and down of player control, right? We explore, this is full control, then we focus on something, this is 0 control. The moments where we opt in to lose control are these 0.5 ones, right? So it's somewhere in between. There's a range that you can play around with. But what we see is that we have this transfer of control between the game and the player. It's a little bit like you want to take 5 steps and then the game takes the control for you. It's like, but first I need to show you something, and now you can continue. But first I need to show you something, right? This per se is not bad or good or something. This is just objectively what has happened in the clip that I've showed you. This is a way for you to visualize how it feels to play the game with the story elements. This is a way to visualize for you the impact that the story elements that you have chosen to tell your story through have on the game flow, right? In this case, the chosen elements, right? So it's cutscene and reading and let's call it cinematography or camera movement, right? They are almost like gravity, right? They are just pulling the graph down, and the player can just put away the controller and basically take a break. What can you now do with this? This is where we come to the next section of this talk, where I will now tell you what, with this visualization and with this new awareness, you can do to improve the flow of game design and story. So I have kind of listed it in a way where the first ones are the less intrusive ones, and then it goes down until the last one is just make a completely new game, basically. But my first point is that this is what I call sort of the rhythm of the game. This is the game flow, right? And so the awareness of this flow can be used strategically, right? I mentioned that this is not bad or good, that letting the player lose control of the game is not a bad thing. An example would be that, let's say, every time the graph is at 1, the player is in a highly intense, adrenaline-boosting situation. Maybe a fight, a match. If it's a horror game, right, it can just be running through a dark forest with some creepy music and you don't know what will jump at you, right? And so, taking away the control from the player in those moments can give them a little bit of a break where they can breathe and recuperate until they have to go on to the next section, right? So, taking away control from the player might sound harsh, but if it's used strategically, you can create a rhythm that allows the player to play maybe longer sessions or more fulfilling sessions that do not exhaust them so much, but always give them a good rhythm and a good flow to continue on with the game. So, what you can also do is make design choices based on a specific flow pattern that you want to achieve, right? So you can try to reverse engineer, basically, and say, this is the rhythm of the game that I want to have. This is what I want the game experience to be like. When would I need to place my story elements to achieve this flow? That is, of course, if you have chosen story elements that are passive. And with that, I mean cutscenes and reading and dialogue, things like that. Because there are also other story elements that you can use that are more interactive, but I'll talk about them later, right? So if you have a game that uses a lot of these elements, and you notice maybe during a playtesting session that players feel like they're being interrupted, you could see maybe, okay, how can I rearrange that maybe to create a specific pattern that I'm looking for? An interesting example are roguelikes. Hades, for example, has very clearly divided when a story happening and when a story not happening. Right? They have said there are 2 phases in the game. There's the phase where you are in the house and you can engage with the story, and you can discover what is new in the house, what has changed. And you're in an environment that is not very high pressure and where you have room to breathe and receive the story. And then after you leave the house and you go on your run through hell, basically, that's where the high pressure moment comes in. That's where the player would be too distracted to receive story, maybe. They do have smaller breaks in there with the level design, for example, and sometimes you do meet characters and exchange a couple of words, but it's not the main portion where story is happening. They have clearly divided, here's a lot of story and here's not a lot of story. And that is also something that you can consciously decide when you have your game like this. So another thing where if you already have story, you already have a project and you notice, okay, I'm seeing that this is not working, that the flow is not working, that players are not engaging with the elements as much as I want to. What you then could do is also, take something out. Sometimes less is more, right? So in this case, for example, I have taken out this story element and this story element, right? And then I have sections where player is for a little bit of a longer time in control. Now, why is that important? It's important because if you choose to leave out specific story moments in your game, you create room to use the player's imagination, right? And that is important because, especially in emotional games or in horror games, for example, sometimes what your brain comes up with is much more relevant than what the writer would come up with in times, right? So there can be games where you want to tell a very sad story maybe, but whatever is sad to you might not be sad to the player. And so that could be a moment where they disengage with it, right? So example would be, right, you have A there, and it turns to B. And in this version, you would explain how A turns to B. But if you leave out what happens here, players can fill in the blanks by themselves. And in doing so, they will always put in something that is relevant to them. And what happens then is that players start seeing themselves in the game. You are telling a story with the player together, and they start to see themselves reflected in the game, right? And so if you want to have a game that has a very profound emotional impact on players, that's how you can do it. In horror games or in horror movies, for example, that's something that you maybe noticed yourself. Oftentimes the monster in a horror film is much scarier when you don't see it, when you only get hints of it, right? Just a movement here, a shadow there, a sound in the background. And whatever your mind comes up with is the scariest thing you could imagine, literally. But then once you see it, and if production value is maybe not so good, it kind of almost becomes laughable, and it loses all its magic, right? So sometimes consider taking out moments in your game flow to allow the player to put in their own imagination. Now, what happens if you say, listen, I don't want this huge divide between player control and player losing control, right? What if you want to have more from 1 to 0, 5 or the other way around? Is that possible? Of course, everything's possible, but that means that you maybe have to look at the way you are telling story. What kind of story element have you chosen? What kind of story mechanic have you picked for your game to narrate the story with? Because this happens if you have story elements that are very passive, that come from, let's say, traditional media like movies and books, right? Those are media where okay, with book it's not super passive because you have to turn the pages, but the story in the book will still stay the same regardless of how fast you read it. A movie will continue on without you watching it or not. But you can think about the choice of story element, right? So you can try to find a main game mechanic that will tell the story for you. And there are two ways you can go about it. So the first one is to gamify your story. This is what, like an example are the Telltale games, right? They have decided, okay, we want to have dialogue options, right? And then if players choose them, we see the consequences of their choices and see how the story turns out. We see this story way, basically, now also reflected in Bandersnatch from Netflix, right? Where TV shows are now trying to become more interactive on and on. In this case, the graph would look like that most of the time player control is at 0, and then when a dialogue is there, it's at 0.5, right? This is where player input is required for the story to continue, but the choices are limited, right? So it's not full control. And so, as I mentioned, having player control at 0 is not necessarily a bad thing. It just needs to be a conscious choice if that is the kind of game and story you want to tell. The other option is the opposite way, right? Where you use game mechanics and the rules of a game to tell stories. So as an example, I have picked Inside here, which is telling a very profound story without any bit of text or dialogue or cutscene at all. It only uses what you can do as a player, what kind of mechanics you have, and how the environment reacts to your actions. And this is another case, for example, where leave room for the imagination, because there's room for interpretation because of that. And everyone can think of like the most magnificent way of how this world makes sense to them, because we notice that there's an internal rule set. If we do this, this is how we are punished for it. If we do that, this is how we are rewarded for that. Why that is up to the player to kind of come up with the story of like why that type of world exists where the environment responds to us behaving in this way, right? But so those are like kind of the true extremes. If we would create a graph for Inside, what we would see is that basically player input is always at 1, and maybe there are small sections where the character moves 2 steps on their own. So in those cases we could say, okay, it goes down to 0.5, but this is an instance where those are the two extremes of basically how you can narrate story, either through game mechanics and rules, or to gamify your main story and the choice of mechanic itself. Now, the most extreme version of what you can do if you want to have a different flow pattern is what I call player equals main character. So this is basically a way of something that is kind of like the show don't tell approach in books and movies, where in those cases they say, for example, don't just tell me that the character is sad, but instead describe how the curtains are blue and the color represents the sadness, or something like that, right? And so with this show don't tell approach for games, it would mean, basically translated, don't tell, but experience. With these games, there is no divide between player and avatar. The player is in the shoes of the avatar, right? So the two examples that I've picked here are Papers, Please and Shenzhen.io, where in Papers, Please you play this border control guard that has to stamp passports every day and be influenced by the rules that the government is giving to them. And in Shenzhen.io, you're playing an engineer that gets sort of their jobs in there, and they have to create this elaborate chips, while also noticing that something weird is going on for the company that they just started working in, right? And so when in these cases player loses control, it's not just the player that loses control. It is also the main character that is losing control. It's part of the story why they lost control. When Alan Wake finds the manuscript pages, we as players lose control. He doesn't, right? He collects the page, he reads the page, he's saying something. He has a full-on beautiful scene, but we as players are not part of it. We lose the connection to him in that moment. With games like these, that doesn't happen because player equals main character. That is, of course, a very different approach. This is also not something that you do in the middle of a production, but when you try to come up with a new game. But that is a way where if you have a story, for example, first, you can use the story to come up with a unique main mechanic, and then in turn, think of a different way of telling the story. Because if I see a movie that tells me, hey, this is about a man in a booth stamping passports all day, or maybe if it's a French art house movie, it could be exciting, but otherwise, nothing there tells me that it's very cool to do and watch him do this over and over and every day. But as a player, this is one of the most engaging games ever, right? You just look at what are the rules today, let's go stamp, 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 and it feels very satisfying. It's this whole experience. As a movie, as a passive watcher, you just watch this man stamp over. And of course, it's also a story, but it's a very different story to what you experience in the game here. So that was a lot, and so I will use this chance to sum up what I have talked about here. So, number one, simple. Story is not just an added element on top of your game. Story is an integral part of the game loop. It takes up space, it takes up time, and most importantly, based on your choice of storytelling element, it can also take up control. So what can you do to sort of remedy that, to bring game design and story closer together and more in flow with each other? Consider the rhythm of the game, right? The timing of your story elements is just as important as the choice of storytelling elements, mechanics. Other things you can do is sometimes less is more. Consider taking out maybe portions of the game that are not super crucial for the player, and actively involve the player's imagination to your advantage, so that you and the player together are able to tell a story that resonate with each other. You can also decide to shape the game design through the narrative, either by gamifying your story or by letting the rules and the mechanics of the game tell the story by themselves. And last but not least, you can try to reduce the disconnect between player and avatar, right? So where you put the player in the avatar's position and let them inhabit a role in that sense. And that's it already. Thank you very much. I think we have time for a Q&A session. Cool. Yeah, so this is my social media. I made it to Blue Sky. And feel free to reach out there to me if you have questions. But yeah, we have time for questions. Anything coming up already now? Because there's also the option to have a hangout session afterwards, if that is something that you are more interested in doing. But yeah, All right, well, thank you being here. Thank you for your attention, and I wish you all a nice Devcom.